The call to the dawn prayer reached Yusuf before the light did, drifting down over the rooftops and over the water from the small mosque at the edge of the village, and he was already awake to hear it, lying on the mat on the roof of his house, where he had slept since the heat began in earnest back in May. The river below was still black, though a thin gray line had started along the eastern hills, and the palms that grew along the bank stood up motionless against it, their fronds hanging heavy and still in the last cool hour before the day properly began. He rose, folded the mat, and went down the outside stair to wash at the jar by the door before he went to pray, and by the time he came back up, the light had changed from gray to the pale gold that belonged to this hour and no other, spreading flat and low across the water and catching the sail of his boat, where it lay furled against the mast down at the landing. Amina was already at the oven in the yard, feeding dried dung cakes and a few sticks of tamarisk into the fire beneath it, and the smell of the bread starting to bake reached him before he'd finished the last turn of the stair. She looked up and did not stop working. "The wind is good," she said. It was not really a question. She had been married to a riverman for 11 years and knew the wind as well as he did by now, judging it off the movement of the smoke and the particular sound the palms made when there was enough of it to matter. "Good enough. We'll have it behind us most of the way to the town, and I'll want it in front of us coming home loaded, which is exactly backward from what a lazy man would ask for and exactly right for a working one." He said this most mornings in one form or another, and she made the same small sound of amusement she always made, not quite a laugh, and turned the bread. Their eldest, Farid, 12 years old, came down the stair rubbing his eyes and went straight past his mother's bread to the low wall where he could see the boat, the way he did every morning, as though it might have changed in the night. "Is Amrisk bringing his son again?" "If God wills it. Go and eat something before you ask me a second question." Farid ate standing up, the way boys eat when their mind is already down at the river, 3 folds of the flat bread with a smear of white cheese and a handful of dates from the jar by the door, and Yusuf let him go before he'd properly finished chewing, because there was cargo to load, and a boy who could carry a rope end was worth having down there early rather than late. The village was waking around them in the particular unhurried way of a place that has been waking the same way for longer than anyone could put a number to. Down the lane, a woman was calling a stubborn donkey by name, in a voice that suggested this was not the first morning the donkey had tested her patience. Smoke stood up straight from a dozen ovens into the still air. Somewhere past the last houses, a water wheel had already started its low, endless groaning turn. The ox, walking its blindfolded circle, to lift river water up into the channels that fed the cotton fields beyond, a sound so constant in that village that a stranger noticed it within the first hour, and a man who had grown up there stopped hearing it entirely, the way a man stops hearing his own heartbeat. Down at the landing, Yusuf's boat sat low and broad-beamed against the bank, her single tall mast bare for now, the great triangular sail still furled and lashed along the yard. She was not new. He had bought her from his own father 20 years before, and his father had bought her from a man in Kenya before that. But she was sound, her hull recalked every year before the low-water season, her ribs and planking the pale color of old wood that had spent its whole life wet and dry and wet again, and had made its peace with both. Amrisk was already there with his own son, a boy a year older than Farid, and the two men greeted each other the unhurried way of men who had loaded cargo together for 2 decades and had nothing left to prove to one another about it. Cotton or dates today? Both, if the boy can carry as much as he claims. Amriska's son, overhearing this, immediately picked up 2 sacks at once to prove a point his father had made purely to provoke exactly that response. And both men allowed themselves the small private satisfaction of watching it work. They loaded through the cool of the early morning, bales of raw cotton from the fields behind the village, bound tight and pale, and baskets of dates packed in from the palms further south, and 2 crates of oranges that a neighbor was sending to a cousin in the town who had, by every account, married well enough to afford oranges brought to him rather than growing his own. The boat took the weight low and settled deeper into the brown water, and Yusuf walked her waterline once around, the way his father had taught him, checking for anything sitting wrong before he judged her ready. They cast off as the sun cleared the hills properly, and Farid worked the sail up with Amrisk's son under Yusuf's direction, the great canvas catching the light before it caught the wind, and then filling all at once with a sound like a held breath let go, and the boat leaned and found her line and began to move. The river did the rest. It always had. A man on the Nile did not so much travel as he arranged himself correctly within something that was already moving, and Yusuf sat at the steering oar with the rope of the sail loose in one hand, adjusting by feel more than by thought, and let the current and the following wind carry the boat downstream at a pace that asked almost nothing of him beyond attention. The morning unspooled the way it always did on the water. Palm groves slid by on both banks, their green almost startling against the pale gold of the desert standing back beyond the cultivated strip, and here and there a water wheel turned, and here and there a woman knelt at the edge to fill a jar or wash a length of cloth, straightening to watch the boat pass with the unhurried interest of people who had watched 10,000 boats pass and would watch 10,000 more. A heron stood motionless in the shallows and did not trouble itself to move for them. Another boat came up the far side, working against the current under oars, and the 2 crews called across the water to each other, names and a joke about the price of dates this season, voices carrying clean and flat over the surface the way sound does on a still river. Farid sat forward with his knees drawn up, watching the bank the way he always did, and after a while he came back to sit near his father. Grandfather sailed this same stretch. He did. So did his father before him. There is a bend past the sycamore stand where a man can feel the current pull if he knows to expect it. I'll teach you the feel of it before we're back home tonight. Your grandfather taught it to me on this exact boat, near enough this exact hour of the morning. Will I teach it to someone too? Yusuf looked at his son a moment, and then back at the water ahead. That's rather up to you and rather up to God in about equal measure, but I expect so. They reached the town by the middle of the morning, the minarets and the customs house coming up first out of the haze, and then the crowded landing itself. A dozen boats tied 3 deep along the stone quay, porters calling, a man with a cart of melons arguing cheerfully with another man about the melons, the whole waterfront a single continuous negotiation conducted at considerable volume, and as far as Yusuf could tell after 20 years of watching it, mostly for its own enjoyment. The unloading and the selling took the better part of 2 hours. The cotton went to a broker Yusuf had dealt with for years, a careful, unhurried man who examined every third bale by hand before he named his price. And the dates and oranges went in smaller lots to 3 different buyers in the market itself, Farid carrying baskets on his head the way he'd been taught, back straight, and counting the coins into his father's palm afterward with the serious concentration of a boy who took the arithmetic of it more seriously than almost anything else in his life. At noon, the men found shade under an awning near the customs house and ate bread and cheese and a handful of green onions, and Amrisk produced a paper twist of roasted seeds from somewhere inside his robe and shared them out. And they talked for a while about nothing of consequence. The price of rope, whose cousin had bought a second boat, whether the flood this year would come early or late, a subject on which every man present had a confident opinion, and none of them agreed. This was also part of the work, in its way. A man who did not know what the other rivermen knew was a man who would find out too late that a channel had silted or a customs officer had grown particular about paperwork. They bought what they had come to buy: a length of good rope, 2 new baskets, a small quantity of tea and sugar, a bolt of cloth Amina had asked for, and loaded it aboard. And by early afternoon, they were pushing off from the crowded quay and out into open water again, this time with the wind against them for the run home, exactly as Yusuf had predicted at dawn, tacking the boat back and forth across the channel in long, unhurried angles, Farid handling the sheet now with real competence while his father worked the steering oar. The afternoon went slower than the morning, as it always did going upstream, but it went. The heat built through the middle hours, and then began, by slow degrees, to loosen its grip as the sun swung west, and the light that had been white and flat at noon began to take on the first hints of the gold it would properly become by evening. Amriska's boat, empty and light, drew ahead of them on one long tack and then fell behind on the next, and the 2 crews traded the same handful of jokes they had traded 100 times before, each one landing exactly as well as it had the first time. They came in sight of the village as the light was going properly gold, the water wheel's low complaint carrying out across the water to meet them before anything else did, and Yusuf brought the boat into the landing with the easy final maneuver of a man who had done it several thousand times, and Farid was over the side with the mooring line before the hull had fully kissed the bank. Amina was waiting near the top of the landing with the youngest child on her hip, and she did not ask how the day had gone, because she could read it plainly enough in the empty hold and the unhurried way her husband and son were coiling rope rather than rushing anything. Good prices. Fair ones. The broker tried to tell me cotton was soft this week. I told him the cotton felt exactly as firm as it did last week, and we settled somewhere in the middle, as we always do. He handed her the small bundle of tea and sugar and the bolt of cloth, and she turned it over once approvingly and said nothing more about it, which from Amina was its own form of high praise. They walked up together through the lane, past the ovens now cooling from the evening's second baking, past the water wheel still making its endless turn, past neighbors sitting out in the last of the light with their own children and their own small talk. Greetings passed back and forth the whole way up, as unremarkable and constant as breathing. Supper was simple: bread and a stew of beans and onions that had been sitting on the low fire most of the afternoon, and the last of the season's melon, sweet and cold from where it had sat in a jar of water since morning. They ate sitting on the roof as the light went. the whole family together, Farid recounting the day's arithmetic and the price of the cotton with more enthusiasm than the subject strictly warranted, and his younger sister falling asleep sitting upright against her mother's side before the meal was even properly finished. The call to the evening prayer came as the last color went out of the western sky, drifting across the rooftops the same unhurried way it had come at dawn, and Yusuf went down to wash and pray, and came back up to find Amina had already laid the youngest two down on their mats, and Farid, lying on his own mat with his hands behind his head, looking up at a sky that had gone from violet to a deep, star-crowded blue. "Tell me about the bend again, the one with the current." "Past the sycamores. You feel it before you see anything change. The oar goes heavier in your hand for no reason you could point to, and then a moment later the water shows you why, boiling up faintly along the near bank where it's cutting under itself." Yusuf lay down on his own mat a few feet away, the whole rooftop cooling now under the enormous clear sky, the last of the heat rising up off the mud brick walls and going out into the dark. "Your grandfather showed it to me on a night not so different from this one. I expect I was about your age. Did you feel it the first time?" "Not the first time, not the second either. But I felt it eventually, and once you feel it once, you feel it forever after, the same current every single time you pass, familiar as an old friend's handshake." Farid didn't answer. His breathing had already gone slow and even, the particular unguarded stillness of a boy who had carried baskets on his head and hauled sail rope since before dawn and had nothing left in him to keep awake for. Below them, the river went on the way it always went, dark now and enormous, carrying the whole of that stretch of the world quietly along toward the sea, the way it had carried it every night since long before Yusuf's grandfather's grandfather had first learned the feel of the current past the sycamores, and would carry it on long after every name on that rooftop had been forgotten, and every boat now tied at the landing had gone to pieces and been replaced a dozen times over. The water wheel had stopped for the night. The ovens had gone cold and dark. Somewhere down the lane, a dog settled itself with a single grunt and said nothing further. Amina lay down on her own mat near the children, and for a while the two adults lay there in the enormous quiet, with the stars turning slowly overhead the way they always did, unhurried, indifferent, and entirely beautiful. "Fair prices," Yusuf said again, mostly to himself, mostly satisfied, and closed his eyes, and the river went on beneath the whole sleeping village exactly as it always had, and he slept